Hello, welcome back to part two of chapter four. It's me, Mr. Humphrey, reading Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. Slight change, I've got an e-version of it, and hopefully you can read along on screen with me a little bit easier. So, time to get rid of my face, and let's get stuck in. Needless to say, Richard didn't. Richard glanced around the table to see if there was anybody else he recognised from his time at college. 2 places away to the left was the Don who'd been Richard's Director of Studies in English, who showed no signs of recognising him at all. This was hardly surprising, since Richard had spent his 3 years here assiduously avoiding him, often to the extent of growing a beard and pretending to be someone else. Next to him was a man whom Richard had never managed to identify. Neither, in fact, had anyone else. He was a thin, vole-like, and had the most extraordinary long, bony nose. It really was very, very, very long and bony indeed. In fact, it looked a lot like the controversial keel which had helped the Australians win the America's Cup in 1983. And this resemblance had been much remarked upon at the time, although not, of course, to his face. No one had ever said anything to his face at all. No one. Ever. Anyone meeting him for the first time was too startled and embarrassed by his nose to speak, and the second time was worse because the first time, and so on. Years had gone by now, 17 in all. In all that time he had been cocooned in silence. In Hall it had long been the habit of the college servants to position a separate set of salt and pepper and mustard on either side of him, since no one could ask him to pass them, and someone sitting on the other side of him was not only rude, but completely impossible, because of his nose being in the way. The other odd thing about him was a series of gestures he made, and repeated regularly throughout every evening. They consisted of tapping each of the fingers on his left hand in order, and then one of the fingers on his right. He would then occasionally tap some other part of his body, a knuckle, an elbow, or a knee. Whenever he was forced to stop this by the requirements of eating, he would start blinking each of his eyes instead, and occasionally nodding. No one, of course, had ever dared to ask him why he did this, though they were all consumed with curiosity. Richard couldn't see who was sitting beyond him. In the other direction, beyond Reg's deathly neighbour, was Watkin, the classic professor, a man of terrifying dryness and oddity. His heavy rimless glasses were almost solid cubes of glass, within which his eyes appeared to lead independent existences like goldfish. His nose was straight enough and ordinary, but beneath it he wore the same beard as Clint Eastwood. His eyes gazed swimmingly around the table as he selected who he was going to be spoken at tonight. He had thought that his prey might be one of the guests, the newly appointed head of Radio 3 who was sitting opposite. But, unfortunately, he'd already been ensnared by the music director of the college and a professor of philosophy. These two were busy explaining to the harassed man that the phrase "too much Mozart" was, given any reasonable definition of those 3 words, an inherently self-contradictory expression, and that any sentences which contained such a phrase would thereby be rendered meaningless, and could not, consequently, be advanced as part of an argument in favour of any given programming scheduling strategy. The poor man was already beginning to grip his cutlery too tightly. His eyes darted about, desperately looking for rescue, and made the mistake of lighting on those of Watkins. "Good evening," said Watkin, with smiling charm, nodding in the